Hello and welcome to Mytech U for the October 2016 edition, where today we are going to be talking about how to get a return on your technology. Yes, that's a little bit of a variation of return on investment, but specifically today we're going to be talking about your technology investment and some of the successes that we've seen and sharing some ways in which Mytech has worked with clients, how we've leveraged this to work on the way of not just investing in a workstation or an application, but how do we really start getting information that helps us run the organization, getting information that aligns with our processes and procedures and systems. How do we really work on some of those topics? So today we're joined by Leif Wildenberg, the President and CEO of Mytech. Thanks for joining us, Leif.
Thanks, Nate.
And so really this is going to be a little bit of an interview question, but we're going to build some foundation to start as far as, and I'm Nate Austin, by the way. Sometimes I forget to introduce myself. So as we get going here, we're just going to start with, all right, we're talking about really at a big picture perspective, trying to frame this up. We know a lot of our customers and companies and organizations are looking into next year, and they're probably going to have or thinking about what goals and things do they want to accomplish next year. So Leif, can you, at a high level, what are some of the ways that, what are some of the things Mytech does to just work with their team to set goals and initiatives for, for the year ahead?
Sure. So first and foremost, we go through an annual planning process. We implement EOS, or Entrepreneurial Operating System. So we bring in a facilitator to walk us through priorities that we feel are important for 2017 and capture those and get agreement with the leadership team as to what initiatives we need to be working on in 2017 and make sure that aligns to our 3-year, 5-year, 10-year plan. But it starts with an annual planning session with the Mytech leadership team to develop those initiatives, and then start to break those down into quarterly initiatives from a priority perspective.
Gotcha. Okay. So just to make sure I understood, so there's typically when do you do that, and how long is it? Is it as far as engaging?
It's usually in fourth quarter. So we'll be doing that, I think, mid-November this year, and it's usually a 2-day engagement. 1 day to go through and get all of our kind of brainstorming and things aligned to our 3-year plan, and then the second day really to focus on how do we prioritize and put those into some type of a rhythm for the year.
All right, very good. So that's what we want to start with, just to kind of a high level, give you an example. Not that you have to do it that way, not that you as an organization have to leverage Entrepreneurial Operating System. There's lots of other methodologies out there that are similar in nature, but just wanted to share a little bit of an idea of an example of sitting down with your leadership team and looking into 2017. And I think one of the key takeaways I remember, Leif, that we as a leadership team actually have, this year we're doing a much better job, but in past years, where we sat down and we laid out our 2017 or our next year initiatives, that here are the 7 things we really want to make progress on next year, or a few things or whatever they are, and we didn't do a good job of reviewing them throughout the year. So we came to the end of the year that we did the planning, we looked back and we said, you know what, we set these priorities, but we didn't actually do a good job of aligning to those.
Right.
So I think that's a little bit of what we'll talk about today too, is trying to help, how do we keep those in front of us as we work through some of these details. Okay. So let's start by laying a little foundation here. For some of you who have probably seen this before, this is Mytech's IT maturity model. We actually kind of lay this out as far as understanding how the infrastructure and the investments you make align and how you need to build them. So for instance, there's a dotted line across the middle of the screen, and above that line is the effort that we're talking about with regard to the above the line concept. And the above the line is really where you can start seeing a return on your technology investment, as the arrow pointing to the top suggests. And so this conversation today is really going to be about those 2 parts of the pyramid or the triangle that are above the line. We're going to be talking about how some of the tactical ways in which you can engage and look at these things in order to help improve. But those aligned is kind of the foundation. You need to have those things in place in order to leverage them. They need to be stable. They need to work. They need to fit your business. But once you have that down, then working above the line is where you really can start leveraging efficiency and providing more, being able to serve your mission more by leveraging technology to actually do more with less, be able to serve more people or deliver more product with the same level of staff. So that's really the objective. It's not just for the sake of IT. It's not just for the sake of technology. It's just these are the things that we've found have really driven efficiency and return on their technology investment within our customers. So that's just a little foundation. One of the slides, one of the pieces I love personally, and I know is Stephen Covey's habit number 2, which is begin with the end in mind. Right? So if you need to know where you're going, you need to know where you're going if you're going to plan how to get there. And so that's one of the reasons why, when you think about where do we begin, we talk about reporting. So Leaf, it's really about the information that you need to run a business. So when you think about it as a CEO and a president, what information are you really keying in on to help you run the business? What type of information?
Sure, and I think there's a good distinction. So, when I kind of put my CEO hat on, there's really one number that I am looking at, and that is what drives valuation of the organization. How do I measure that? What is the number one valuation metric that I would be looking to watch and to manage to? And then from an operational perspective, in my role as the president, then I start to look at some of those supporting numbers behind there, and some of them are around, financial. What are our cash flow metrics? What are our are we hitting our revenue targets? Are we on target to our budget? And then, there's a couple other departmental things. For Mytech here, we really break our business down into 2 areas, sales and service. So, how is my service team delivering? There's some qualitative metrics and some quantitative metrics there. Are we getting good customer interaction? Are we meeting our deadlines for our customers, response times and resolution times? And on the sales side, are we driving the right behaviors with our salespeople to generate the business that we need to either hit our targets or our growth goals?
So thank you for elaborating on that. I think, and distinguishing between the CEO kind of vision versus the president role and vision and expectation, and the different data that they need. I think that some of this, to everyone listening and watching, is that those things might be obvious, right? And that, hey, you need certain information, but the important thing is that you identify it, right? That you identify what are those key pieces of information you really need. And I think, Leif, I appreciate you. The one thing you mentioned as a CEO, there's really one thing you look at. There's one key component, which is the driving the value in the business, and that's part of the CEO's role. But then there's other supporting. So that's great. So that actually segues to the next question, which is, okay, so now you've identified some of these different areas and supporting roles, and you mentioned the different departments in the organization. What have you found to be important with collaborating with the different departments? Now that you understand, now you have the information you need. You said there's information I need to run the business, so I can be keeping my eye on things. How do you then translate that and collaborate with the different departments?
Right. So again, I think it starts with the end in mind, and that is, how are we driving value in the organization? Every single department or leader of those departments has a piece to that valuation metric or number. And so where we start is, what is their contribution to that valuation, to bring more value to Mytech? And so sales is a little different than service, but having the discussion with them as to how do they contribute to that value, and then that starts, once we can identify that, then we can start to dig a little deeper into what are the activities, what are the behaviors, what are the things that you will need to manage to roll that number up to our valuation number.
That's great, Leif. I think, yeah, that is helpful. And I think one of the things is a quick takeaway that I know that I feel sometimes it's a challenging when we're talking about reporting and information is that someone in your role has the information, but sometimes it's challenging to either A, share that information easily with the departments, as well as making sure that they understand how the behaviors that they're working on really drive towards the metrics and the information and the right results. So and having them have that opportunity to engage. So so I heard that loud and clear with what you said, but I think sometimes it's just being able to share that information. So collaborating with them on that was an important part. So wanted to make sure we touched on that. So all right, so now that we have an idea of the information we need, we've collaborated with our team a little bit to understand here kind of the behaviors that we're looking for to drive the results. So let's then talk about, there's different levels of maturity as far as the systems you're using or the reporting that's available to you depending on the systems, all that, the systems you're using inside your organization. So can you help us, give us a background? You definitely have a technical background as well. What have you seen as far as where did you start with reporting and what kind of path have you taken over time?
Yeah, so this is where it gets complex as your organization either grows. I mean, it was much easier when we were smaller because I was a lot closer to the data, and I was able to, mine the data in a way that was, how can I say this, was more ad hoc. So if I wanted to know, how our sales was doing, typically that was one salesperson that I could go and talk to. So a lot of it was more social ways of getting the information. But as we started to grow, we needed to formalize some of that. And the first point was, looking back, I made a ton of mistakes, but the first point was the same. What is the data that supports the overall number? And trying to find those data points and where the data is, really depended upon some of the sophistication of the systems we had. If we were, back when we first started Mytech doing quotes in Excel documents, to get sales data, I would have had to look at 20 different quotes that were currently open. So, so where you start is where the data exists, or where the data exists, or you have to find, where those key points are. And quite honestly, you end up doing it manually to start before you can really do some jumps of the curve, so to speak, to get things automated. So picking a few numbers, understanding where that data resides, and getting that on a consistent basis, and developing some discipline to say, I need this information weekly or biweekly or monthly, and then getting a rhythm on that. And it's really developing a discipline of gathering the data.
So when you started, that makes sense. I mean, manual, maybe using Excel. You mentioned a couple things there. But as things have grown and organizations that we've worked with over time, what kind of things are organizations doing there to really get the information, kind of a higher level of maturity, or and it's not meaning I don't want to be negative about saying higher level maturity, but it's more about going higher up that pyramid that we talked about, right? So you've been building up that pyramid, and you're getting more and more toward the top, and better integration of systems and process and those kind of things. Sure. So what do you see in organizations that have been able to build the pyramid a little higher, so to speak? Yeah,
I mean, I probably today even the number one reporting tool that's out there is Excel. So once you understand where the data is, and you can start to systematize that data and get it into central collection points, typically then you can start to make connections to that data in a more systematic way, either like if it's in a SQL database or if it's in a web form that you can make an API call to. You can get that data into Excel, and it's still somewhat of a manual to start to manipulate that data, but at least now you're taking your exercise and your time that you're spending of getting the data, being from heavily to the collection side, to reducing the collection side to now more heavily in the analytical side, where you're manipulating the data and developing the reports or developing the charts that give you some visual representation that allows you to make decisions easily. So the next step in that would be going from manual collection to some type of automated collection of the data. So you're changing the paradigm of where you're spending your time of collecting. And just back up, I think initially when you're starting to look at reporting, the manual collection of the data is super important because you learn a lot about where the nuances of the data need to be either massaged or changed, or like you get familiarity as to where the challenges in your data are, so that you can make some adjustments as you start to mature through at the next level.
So I appreciate that last point in particular, because just because you're looking at data, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's telling the whole story, let's say. I know that, and because that just sometimes depends on whether or not your staff are executing the respective tasks consistently or entering data in the same way. So what kind of lessons have you learned? And I think you were kind of hinting at that a little bit as far as you dig in, you start looking at the numbers and the data. What lessons have you learned that definitely that tip that you might apply to other organizations that may be going through the same kind of challenge?
Your output's only as good as your input. And we saw this challenge, even in multiple areas of our business where the data wasn't being put in a way that I was expecting the output to be. And so I was reading and trying to, let's call it fly by wire by some data and making decisions by data, and then I find out that, oh, we don't enter it that way, so the data becomes skewed. So taking those steps back and making sure that that output that you're expecting is there because the input was systematized or put in a way that you're going to get what you're expecting in the output. So the inflows in that data and the structure of the data is important to make sure that there's alignment with both the in and the out.
Yeah, very good. That's definitely what I was driving toward, because just because you get data doesn't necessarily mean that it's always telling the right story, and so if you're not able to make the right decisions, you got to make sure you're digging back into those the garbage in, garbage out is what I hear people say sometimes around that. So all right, well, so continuing on with just kind of looking into your organizational systems and reporting, or taking it to the next step. Now you've identified here, we've looked at the data, we've collaborated with the teams, we've understood some of the challenges and obstacles, or we've as far as in the maturity or the evolution of reporting. So now you have an idea of what that looks like. Well, now, from what you were just saying, you got to now go back at your systems and say, all right, well, when you're looking to realize that, and you're looking to see, well, are we using the systems consistently, or is the system, how are the systems aligning to the information that I need? So, what are the kind of things you look at when you're looking to align your systems with the reporting requirements?
Sure. So, I think we're in a world where, there's not one piece of software that runs the business from front end to the back end. I mean, in our industry, we get close to that, but we're still talking 3 or 4 different systems that give a different view of the organization from an operational perspective or a financial perspective or a business development perspective. So making sure that when the data flows from one system to another, first of all, can it flow from one system to another? That's sometimes the biggest challenge, is reducing the duplication of data, because the minute you start to have to duplicate entry or entry duplication, you also now have another aspect of accuracy that you have to look at. But if you can get your systems to flow from one to the next, are they flowing in a way that they represent the same for, if we take our quoting system, for example, that then flows into our service system, that then flows into our financial system, do they all align and do they represent the data in relatively the same form or exactly the same form? So if I have a product sales in my quoting, does it show up as a product sale in my operational database, and does it show up as a product sale in my financial database? And does that information flow smoothly through that? And it's the same for whether it's services or, whatever your business is, that all has to align correctly, and the staff that are working and manage those numbers need to understand that alignment too, so that if they're making changes, that they don't kind of break the flow between the systems. So you have to be more cognizant of that.
Yeah, with the interconnectivity and the data flow, that's a great point. So I think of I also think around this front as sometimes when we find I know when we worked with customers and they talk about the systems they have, they feel like part of the challenge as far as assessing their system, as far as aligning to the reporting, is that they might not be using all the capabilities of the system that they own or they're using or they're paying for. So have you seen where as the businesses has changed and over time, where trying to identify where systems might get used more, kind of increase the level of utilization of your systems to help with the data and help with some of these reducing the duplication of entry, for example? Have any comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think I don't know if I'm hitting the question, but the thought that came to my mind when you were saying that was that our experience in running our own business and the experience that we've had with customers has been nearly every software package that you buy cannot provide the level of reporting that you actually want for whatever the nuance of your business is. Reporting usually gets 70, 80% of the way there, and that 20% always seems to be kind of the thorn in your side. I wish it would do this. I wish it would do this. So you either develop customized reporting to do that, and engage the provider to get some level of customizations. We've done that over the years to say, you're not quite showing us the way that we look at our business, so we need a special report to do it. In lower level of maturity, the 80% was good enough, but once you hit that level where you're really utilizing that system, that next 10% or 20% of reporting becomes a little more critical. So you don't right away out of the gate need to have a lot of customized reporting. But then it even gets to one step further where you say, I got a data source here and I got a data source here, but I need to be able to marry those two pieces of data together to actually give me the right piece of information that I need to make the decision. So there's a whole kind of thinking that has to go through of how do you align those systems, and what do you really need out of them, and not to overthink it either. Sometimes the canned reports are good enough because you're turning a bigger dial than a smaller dial on the business.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, part of where I want to connect the dot here is that, we're talking about, looking at your systems and realizing that it doesn't always get you where you want and that it changes over time as you mature. But to the end, what we're really talking about as you work on these things is really efficiency of your people's time, right? If as you dig into these details, it's hopefully you're reducing the duplication of entry. You talked about that, right? Don't have people putting information in twice. If you can get reports out more consistently, well, that means people, and I like to, when I talk about this stuff, I know I like referencing the movie Office Space and TPS reports, if anyone has watched that movie. It's like people hate filling out TPS reports. And that takes up their time, and it's something they don't enjoy doing, and it's usually manually done if you're doing it that way, and so it's more prone to error. So part of what you're talking about is looking at the ways in which you can reduce that and reduce the duplication, but at the same time increase efficiency and automation.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, yeah, when we see this as a continual improvement process. As we need now a person to make sure that this field is defaulted in a way so that the data automatically comes out, rather than saying every time you do this you have to go and set this field to this and this field to this. How do you start to automate some of that so that the alignment happens more naturally than manually? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's really it's looking at the ways in which your team functions and operates. How do they use the tools to perform the job and the task that you need them to do? And hopefully, if you can align your systems to that, then you can get reports out in an automated fashion. You don't have to worry about trying to have them say, well, now fill out this Excel spreadsheet once a week for me, because you use the tools in the way that provides that information just naturally. So we've already hit on this next question, so I'm going to skip over that. But what obstacles have you experienced in particular when you're digging into these assessments? And you kind of mentioned one of them earlier. So, and just as a reminder to everyone, you mentioned how nearly every system has something it's not doing what you wished it could do. So that's one of the obstacles you mentioned. What other ones, or can you elaborate on the one that you've already mentioned?
Well, I think the one that we just touched on was the alignment of making sure that the things that need to be, the metadata, the flags in the data so that we can do a report accurately is there. That's been a huge obstacle of getting consistent data. I think the other part is, and this is more of a social side of it, is that when we decide what the data is that everybody is aligned to, where does that data come from? How is it calculated? How is it measured? Because the last thing you want is a leader in your organization of having a number up there that nobody buys into what that number is or doesn't understand what that number comprises of, or what that metric or what that report is saying. So I think the biggest obstacles we have faced and tried to overcome is the visibility of what the data that we're looking at and why we're measuring that, and where does it come from? What is the, not just like the physical source being a SQL database, but it's because I'm taking this number multiplied by this one divided by this one because this is how we get there. And this is a cadence we're going to measure it. We're going to measure it weekly, or we're going to measure it monthly, whatever it is, and making sure that that aligns to being effective, because there are some measurements in reporting that if you measure them weekly, they're just not effective. They're more of a monthly number or a quarterly number or an annual number. And just getting that buy-in, I think, it can be the biggest obstacle, because people want to have impact when you give them those targets to hit. They will go for them if they can impact them.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that last comment. Is that sometimes throwing up numbers and providing information, people naturally. I mean, I believe, and I think we believe collectively, and most people do, that people inherently want to do their job well, right? They want to perform, they want to serve people well, they want to do their job well, and so sometimes that data, if it's misrepresenting the information, or maybe there's a lack of understanding or alignment or communication around the objective, then you can actually do some harm, and that's an obstacle from your team. So great point. Again, I like that what you're talking about, excuse me, is you're really reverse engineering down into your operational processes and the systems, and how are your people in your team using the systems and reporting their time or reporting their activities or tracking the communication, and just doing that and understanding how they do that as how it impacts reporting and how it impacts efficiency is great. So we have touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to ask this question again in maybe a slightly different way. So you talked about how having certain systems integrated, hopefully that they have that capability. If they don't, that's a whole other challenge. But when systems have been integrated, I know that we have systems that are integrated, what some of the benefits that you get from that, and what are the challenges you've seen as far as the way that integration affects the end goal of reporting and getting the right data out?
Well, I mean, the benefits can, quite honestly be all over the board, but the big one is alignment. It's alignment of your team. It's alignment of what is the strategy of the overall business. So if we can provide the right reports or real-time data or dashboards that are accurate and everybody understands, then the management side of the process or the people becomes easier and can be a little more dynamic, and if you get good at it, can be forward-looking enough that you can make course corrections before things might kind of go off the rails. There's the greater the visibility. I mean, the statement of what gets measured gets managed then becomes really really apparent, because everybody's in alignment to why those numbers matter and how does my team affect those. As far as the challenges, I think they're the exact opposite of that. Is when getting to the accurate number, getting leading indicators. There's a lot of value in rear view mirror. How did we do? As a kind of a check as to are we on plan or not. But it's much harder and much more challenging than to start to use that reporting to start to be predictive in the business. And you got to develop all the rear view mirror first and use that as the basis to say, now what are the activities, what are the things that lead into this number, so I can start looking out into the future to say the activities I'm doing today are going to produce the results from 30 days from now, and then 60 days when I look back at that 30 days, I'll have accomplished what I set out to do. So the challenging part, I believe, is converting that into a forward-looking model with the systems.
So that's so at a high level and a reporting part, that's great. I want to also take another way to look at it that's a little bit more tactical. Of, for instance, I know you and I happened to have a conversation this morning. It was about the way our quoting system integrated with our service system, and some of the limitations that has as far as us being able to get the information we want. So is there anything else? Because I think that's an also thing that creates a challenge, that we want this information, we want to make it easy for our team so that it mitigates error, but in the end, the system has limitations that we can't overcome.
Yeah, well, I mean, right. So you got to work with inside the limitations of the system, if possible, to say, here's what we need, so that we, again, keeping the end in mind, to say, I have to go and make a process change, or work with my staff to say this is what needs to happen, and then ensure that that happens in some way, whether it's automated or manual or an exception, so that we can get the data out. Yeah, so those are, I mean, the minute you identify that something's out of alignment, you got to dig all the way back down to the beginning stages and then build back up from there as to the process change or the people change that need to happen. So.
Well, thank you for the segue, which is, this usually when you start making these kind of changes, sometimes you don't have documentation. I know that we've definitely been in that place, and we're working to shore that up and as we identify it. But either you don't have documentation and it leads to wanting documentation, or if you have documentation and you're looking to make change, getting it. Because if you start making these changes, how do you make sure that your team understands that and is executing in the way in which you require? So can you talk to how has this kind of impacted documentation or process in your experience?
In most organizations, it starts out and sometimes ends with, here's the cascading message. So we identified something that needed to be done, and we go around and tell everybody, and a lot of times, and we've been guilty of this, that's where we stopped. Is, okay, we told everybody, but we didn't then put the other things in place to reinforce the behavior, meaning now let's write it down, let's make sure that people have a way to reference back to it, even going further to say let's develop a step-by-step process So the next time we train somebody or hire somebody, we don't have to rely on the fact that that message that we delivered a year ago has to be somehow remembered by the people that may or may not be executing today. So it does get down into systematizing the business a little more, and making those changes, somehow get it out of the tribal knowledge realm and into a documented realm. And again, our challenge is, just speaking for Mytech itself, is we've seen that through, as we've grown with the more employees, more people needed to know. We've hired new people. Things that we thought we communicated well, we didn't, and that required us to really start documenting process differently and procedures differently.
Very good. So I'm going to try and go a little faster through the next couple slides as we're nearing to the end of our time here. But so part of what we've been talking about is, all right, we've identified the information we need. We've started looking at and reverse engineering the systems as far as aligning to the information we want. So now that you've identified all these changes you might potentially want to make, how do you, what method can you share some experience of how you identify which ones are the most important as far as to take action on? Because you can't, it's very rare that an organization can take action on everything at the same time.
Yeah, well, and again, this is where I would go back to our EOS process. So we look at, we try to vision out what do we want the next 12 months to look like. Once we all agree to what that is, then we say, okay, how are we going to get there? And we start to break those down into quarterly objectives, and we, whether they're, big objectives where we say, okay, that's a boulder, or things that we can accomplish in a quarter, that's a rock for us in EOS terms, and defining.
So boulder is something that spans more than a quarter.
More than a quarter.
Gotcha.
Right, and so we typically try to break things down into rocks to say, in the next 90 days, can we make movement to our year-end game, our game plan? If we break those down, then we say, okay, again, let's start with the end in mind. What does success look like? So if I'm going to make this change, I'm going to develop a system so that I can get better visibility into my financials. What does it look like? Let's try to draw that out and be as specific as possible. Make sure somebody owns it, and that somebody's going to drive to it, and be realistic about where we might have some challenges or constraints, and not shoot too big. It's better to, we found that it's better to take, a bunch of smaller steps than try to take one big giant step and never hit the right target. So it's just about incremental, steady change, quarter over quarter over quarter. But making sure somebody clearly knows that they own that initiative, and that initiative then is, we've delegated to them, and they have the ability to drive everything they need to do nearly autonomously to get it done.
Yeah, and as we move on to the next slide, I think you also said something as far as even down to the initiative level, you're driving to what does success look like? Because I know that we've been challenged before where the different people on the team that all agree that this is something we need to accomplish, but there's a lack of understanding up front of where do we need to land? Like, what is this going to look like, and are we in agreement that that's what success looks like? So I appreciate you mentioning that, because it's a breakdown of what does begin with the end in mind, right? So, all right, so now that we've identified bigger ones, what about smaller ones, and what kind of change management have you seen successful that's helped kind of drive incremental continual improvement process?
Yeah, so I mean, if we look all the way back to that maturity model and you go to the reporting, anybody that starts to take on reporting initiatives is going to inevitably find that there are tons of little changes that need to be made for the data to be represented in a way that can be really beneficial from a decision-making process. So one of the things that I've seen with some of our customers and people that we've consulted with is there's, if your company does not start to develop a culture of change, whether it's large change or small change, you may have some challenges. So you have to kind of step through this. But the key is going to always be about communication, and more to what Simon Sinek says about, understanding the why. The biggest challenge of whether a change is big or small is to go to the staff and say, here's the reason why we need the change. And if the why is there, even those small changes, which can have a lot of negative impact, if you're going to your staff and saying, little change here, little change here, little change here, day over day over day, they can get change fatigue. But one of the things that really helps combat against change fatigue is understanding the why behind it. And if they understand that's going to make their job easier, the business perform better, their job's performance easier, it usually ends up being okay.
Yeah, so that's you kind of were hinting at a couple of the things on the next question, which is, what lessons have you learned regarding these changes, and maybe examples of share something where we succeeded or failed. And you kind of talked about why, starting with why is a big part of the success. So I don't know, do you have any anecdotal examples or where you've seen it with customers or internally?
Well, yeah, we just went recently through a relatively big change in the organization with some of the Fair Labor Standards Act stuff, and really getting down, making sure we're answering all the why, and even that then prompts how are we going to do that, but getting deep into the detail enough for them to be able to execute on what they're doing. If they have a blind spot, they will either not engage or engage in a way that doesn't produce the right results, and I think that ultimately comes, leads to the failures that I've seen, we've experienced through just trial and error. Is the more that we can get that why, the less failure we see.
Good. Yeah. One of the things that I keeps coming to mind, something that we recently did too, I know that comes to mind is around we missed the communication, right? It was where different departments were working on an initiative, and different people were responsible for different parts, and it was, I think, twofold. It was a failure where we didn't at a high level coordinate it well enough between the efforts of the different departments, and then as well as I think then communicating it out once a change happened. So I think again, you mentioned it earlier though, communication is really the key, and I think we all have been in business long enough, you realize that a lot of the problems that we all face are communication based. But the last thing I'll ask you before we go to final thoughts is relative to change management. One of the things that, if you have a lot of people requesting changes, or if you have been successful driving the culture of change and getting people involved in the process and understanding the why and making suggestions, you kind of need to have some control points. Have you seen some examples of where, how do you know and who owns authorization of change?
I don't have a direct
bigger
answer
question.
to that, Nate. It's like in our organization, we have taken on the theory that somebody is our change management or our process person, just because it got to a point where everybody owned change and we didn't have a good way to make sure that we could funnel that. We've gotten much better at that, but it's either at a department level or by an assigned person that can help manage that change, or through a process. But I don't really have, for us, it's a very specific person in our organization.
That's good. That's a great example of some way in which you kind of solve that, is you kind of funnel through and kind of have a dedicated person that's responsible for driving it. So, and that might be one of the final thoughts, but the last thought as we get ready to sign off here is, if you're talking to someone that's, just, I don't know, a key takeaway, that if you're really working on above the line initiatives, that again, part of it is the end goal is running in a more efficient organization where you can serve more people or produce more widgets with the same level of staff. It's not just for the sake of technology. What tips or tricks or a lesson that you'd just say is a takeaway for working on those above line initiatives that you'd say to someone today?
Yeah, so, and this is just all based on experience. Like, I originally started with way too many numbers, way too many metrics, if you looked at a dashboard that I created, there would have been 15 to 18 numbers that I was trying to look at. Some were big dials, some were small dials. I would say now to where we are, I wish I could shortcut back 8 years and say, find the one number that really drives the most value in the business. Focus on that one number and the things that feed into that one number. You will have more impact on the business by focusing on the one number that drives the most value to the business, and those key components below that. That's what I would say. It's like I used to focus on way too many numbers.
That's actually a great takeaway. That kind of summarizes a lot of the stuff we were talking about today. So, we are out of time. If there are any questions offline, I'll look at those. I didn't see any coming through as we went along, or I interjected them as we went along. So thanks everyone for joining us. Appreciate you watching the October 2016 edition of Mytech U, and good luck in your planning for 2017. And let us know how we can help. And this recording will be available online within 24 hours. Have a great day, everyone. Signing off.